The cases tonight all happen inside the house, not at the edge of it, not on the porch, not in the yard, not on the street outside, inside. In the room down the hall, in the bedroom one floor above, in the basement directly below the parents who were asleep. Each one of these people was, at the moment something happened to them, in the place that was supposed to be the safest place they knew. And it was not. We begin tonight in the slow, pine-shaded streets of Camden, Arkansas, a small county seat town in the southern half of the state, where the houses are large and old and set back from the road, and the families who live in them have known each other for generations. It is the evening of March the 2nd, 1957, a Saturday. A husband and wife are at home. The television is on. The front door is unlocked, the way front doors in Camden are still unlocked in 1957. The wife is sitting in the living room. The wife in the living room is 56 years old. Her name is Maud Robinson Crawford. She is an attorney. She is sitting in a chair near the front of the room with her glasses on and a cigarette in the ashtray beside her. The television is on. She is watching, half attending, the kind of Saturday night programming a Camden household watched in 1957, a variety show, a serial, the small flickering company of a screen in a quiet room. Her husband Clyde is in another part of the house. The accounts vary slightly on which room. Some say the den, some say a back room, some simply say another room, but the documented detail across every account is that he was not in the living room with her, and that he was not far away. The Crawford home was a modest, single-story house on South Adams Street in Camden, a town of fewer than 15,000 people in South Arkansas, in a neighborhood of large old houses set back from the road under pines. Maud Crawford is one of the most unusual people in Camden in 1957. She is one of the few female attorneys practicing in the state of Arkansas. She had been admitted to the bar decades earlier, in a profession that was, at the time, almost entirely closed to women. She had built a practice in estate law, wills, land titles, family trusts, the slow, careful work of moving property and money across generations. She had a reputation. The reputation was specific. She protected the interests of clients who could not protect their own. Elderly widows whose estates were being maneuvered around by adult relatives. Families whose holdings were under pressure from outside interests. People whose names were on legal documents they did not fully understand. She read every line. She did not let things pass. In South Arkansas in the 1950s, that kind of reputation was both an asset and a liability. It made her a trusted figure to the people who needed her. It made her, to certain others, an obstacle. In the months leading up to March of 1957, she had been working on a particular estate. The estate belonged to a wealthy local family. It involved significant land holdings, timberland, mineral rights, the kind of acreage in South Arkansas that, at the right moment, could be worth more than anyone in the family had previously understood. There were members of the family who wanted the estate to move in one direction. There were members of the family who wanted it to move in another. Maud Crawford was the attorney standing in the middle, holding the documents, making sure nothing moved that should not move. That is the work she was finishing in the months before March the 2nd, 1957. That is the work the case file would, decades later, return to. On the evening of March the 2nd, a Saturday, Maud and Clyde were home. They had been home most of the day. There were no visitors documented at the house that evening. The phone had not rung in any way that anyone later remembered as unusual. The television was on. Maud was in the living room. Clyde was in another room. The first documented gap in the timeline is the gap during which Clyde said he was not with her. He would later tell investigators that he had been in another part of the house for some period of time. The exact duration varies in different tellings, but the general window is somewhere between 15 minutes and an hour. He said he had not heard the front door open. He had not heard a struggle. He had not heard a voice that should not have been in the house. He had not heard anything that, in his telling, indicated anyone but his wife was in the living room. When he came back into the living room, she was not in it. Her glasses were on the chair. Her cigarette was in the ashtray, half smoked. The television was still on. The lamp was still lit. The chair she had been sitting in was empty, in the specific way that a chair is empty when the person in it has just stood up. Not disturbed, not knocked over. Simply unoccupied. The front door was closed. Whether it was locked at that moment is one of the small documented questions of the case. The Crawford's house, like most houses in Camden in 1957, was not the kind of house that was locked when the family was home in the evening. The door was, by long habit, available. Clyde looked through the house. She was not in any of the other rooms. He went outside. She was not in the front yard. He walked around the house. She was not in the back. He came back inside. He called her name. There was no answer. He called the police. The Ouachita County Sheriff's Department arrived. The Camden Police Department arrived. They walked the house. They walked the yard. They looked in the closets, in the basement, in the small spaces that adults sometimes look in first, not because they expect to find someone there, but because looking is what is done. There was no sign of her. There was also no sign of anything else. No sign of forced entry. The doors and windows were intact, locked or unlocked depending on the room, but none of them broken. No sign of struggle in the living room, the chair undisturbed, the ashtray undisturbed, the lamp undisturbed. No sign of bloodshed anywhere in the house. No piece of clothing on a hook that suggested she had been pulled by it. No scuff on a floor that suggested she had been dragged. The living room she had been sitting in looked exactly like a living room that someone had just stood up from, except that the person who had stood up from it was gone. By Sunday morning, the case had moved from a missing person report into a more serious category. The Arkansas State Police were involved. The FBI was contacted. Within days, the case was being investigated as a probable abduction. But the investigation ran into a wall almost immediately. There were no witnesses. There were no signs of struggle. There was no vehicle anyone reported seeing in the Crawford driveway that evening. There were no neighbors who reported hearing anything unusual. There was no demand for ransom in the days that followed, despite the family's known means and the obvious motivation that ransom would have given anyone who took her. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. The case file accumulated. Tips came in. Some of them led somewhere. Most of them did not. The Arkansas State Police interviewed dozens of people in Camden. Family members, clients, opposing parties in the estate cases she had been working on, employees of her law office, household staff, neighbors. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. No one could account for the 15 to 60 minutes during which she had been in the living room alone, and then was not in any room at all. What the investigators began to surface over time was a pattern that the file kept returning to. The estate Maud had been working on at the time of her disappearance was contested, significantly contested. The amount of money at stake, when the timber holdings and the mineral rights were taken together, was substantial. Substantial enough that, in South Arkansas in 1957, certain people had reasons to want certain documents to move in certain directions. Maud Crawford was the attorney making sure they did not. The investigators looked at the people who would have benefited from her absence. They could not connect any of them to the night of March the 2nd. The case held in that uncertain shape for years. In the 1980s, a Little Rock investigative reporter named Beth Brickell took up the case. Brickell had grown up in Camden. She had known of Maud Crawford as a child. She had returned to the case as a journalist, and she had spent years on it. She conducted interviews with people who had been alive in 1957 and were still alive in the 1980s. She walked the documents of the contested estate. She mapped the relationships. She filed open records requests. She produced, over a period of years, the most thorough public investigation of the case that had ever been done. Brickell's reporting, published as a series in the Arkansas Democrat Gazette and later as a book, did not solve the case. It did, however, establish two things with documentary clarity. The first was that Maud Crawford had been working, at the time of her disappearance, on legal matters that gave specific identifiable parties specific identifiable motivations to want her work to stop. The second was that the original investigation in 1957 had not pursued those motivations with the rigor that they would have warranted. The reasons for that, according to Brickell's reporting, had to do with the social fabric of Camden in the 1950s. The families involved in the contested estate were prominent. The connections between those families and the local power structure were extensive. The pressure to direct an investigation away from certain individuals, even if no one ever named the direction, was understood by everyone in town. Maud Crawford's body was never recovered. No piece of her clothing was ever found. No witness ever came forward. No deathbed confession ever surfaced. No anonymous letter ever arrived in a sheriff's office to redirect the investigation. The case is still officially open with the Ouachita County Sheriff's Department. The file has been reviewed multiple times by successive generations of Arkansas investigators. No charges have ever been brought. No suspect has ever been publicly named by law enforcement. The contested estate was settled in the years following her disappearance, in directions that, Brickell's reporting documents, would not have been settled the same way if Maud had still been alive to handle the work. Clyde Crawford lived for some years after his wife's disappearance. He never remarried. He continued to live, for a period, in the house on South Adams Street. He continued to give the same account of the evening of March the 2nd to anyone who asked. He had been in another room. He had not heard anything. He had come back into the living room, and she had not been in it. He was, by every account from people who knew him, devastated by her loss for the rest of his life. He died without an answer. The house on South Adams Street is still there. It has had other residents since the Crawfords. The street is still pine-shaded. The houses are still large and set back from the road. Camden is smaller than it was in 1957. The timber industry has moved on. The families have moved on. The world that produced the contested estate of 1957 has receded into the local memory of an older generation that is itself receding. What remains is one detail. The cigarette was in the ashtray. It was still half smoked. In the living room, she did not voluntarily leave. What happened to Maud Crawford should have been impossible, and yet, 3 years earlier, in a house on the shore of Lake Erie, a woman would be killed in her own bed while her husband slept one floor below. The house sits on the shore of Lake Erie. It is a 2-story home in Bay Village, Ohio, a small lakeside suburb west of Cleveland, the kind of place where the streets end at the water and the lots back onto a low bluff above the lake. The house is at 28924 West Lake Road. Behind it, the ground drops away to a narrow beach. Beyond the beach is the lake. In July of 1954, the lake is dark and warm and quiet at night. Upstairs, in the second-floor bedroom that faces the lake, a young pregnant woman is asleep in her own bed. Her name is Marilyn Sheppard. She is 31 years old. She is 4 months pregnant with the couple's second child. The bedroom she is sleeping in is the bedroom she decorated herself. Downstairs, in the living room, on the first floor, her husband is asleep on a daybed. He is Dr. Samuel Sheppard, Sam, 30 years old, a young osteopathic surgeon at Bayview Hospital, the small osteopathic hospital his family owns and runs in Bay Village. He had come home from a long day of surgical work, had dinner with friends who came over that evening, and had fallen asleep on the daybed in the living room around midnight while the others were still talking. He had not gone upstairs to bed. Up the hall from Marilyn's bedroom, in the next room, the couple's 7-year-old son, Sam Reese Sheppard, known in the family as Chip, is asleep in his own bed. The house also has a dog. The dog is downstairs. That is the configuration of the Sheppard home in the early hours of July 4th, 1954. Sometime in those early hours, something happens in the upstairs bedroom. What happens in that bedroom has been the subject of one of the most contested investigations in American legal history. 70 years of it, 2 criminal trials, a landmark Supreme Court decision, a civil trial decades after the fact, multiple rounds of DNA analysis, books, documentaries, a television series, a reopened investigation in the 1990s that produced new evidence and new disagreement about what the new evidence meant. What is documented, what every account agrees on, is this. Sometime between 3 and 4 in the morning on July 4th, 1954, Marilyn Sheppard was killed in her bedroom. The attack was sustained. The number of blows was significant. The bedroom showed extensive evidence of the attack. The child in the next room did not wake. The dog downstairs did not, according to the documented accounts, bark. The husband downstairs heard something. That is the documented next fact in the timeline, and it is the fact around which 70 years of contested investigation has organized itself. Sam Sheppard would tell investigators, and would tell every subsequent investigator and every subsequent court, that he had been asleep on the daybed in the living room when he was woken by the sound of his wife's voice. She was calling his name. He was not entirely sure, at the moment of waking, whether the call was real or a fragment of a dream. He got up, he went up the stairs. In the bedroom he saw a figure. He saw his wife. He went toward the figure. He was struck. He lost consciousness. That is the first part of his account. The second part is what he said happened after he came to. He woke on the floor of the bedroom. He saw his wife. He checked her pulse. There was none. He went next door to his son's room. The child was still asleep. He went back out into the hallway. He heard a sound from downstairs. He went down the stairs. In the living room, he saw a figure again, the same figure in his account, or possibly a different figure. He was not certain. He pursued the figure out of the house, across the back lawn, down the bluff toward the lake. He caught up with the figure on the beach. There was a struggle. He was, again, struck. He again lost consciousness. He woke for the second time on the beach, in shallow water. He made his way back up to the house. He called a neighbor, the mayor of Bay Village, who came over with his wife. The mayor's wife went upstairs. She saw Marilyn. She called the police. By the time the Bay Village police arrived, the scene of the case had already begun to be compromised. People had been in and out of the house. The mayor had been in the bedroom. The mayor's wife had been in the bedroom. Sam Sheppard's brother, a physician, had arrived and had been in the bedroom. The body had been examined. The room had been walked through. The integrity of the crime scene, by the standards of modern investigation, was already gone. What followed was one of the most heavily covered criminal investigations of the 1950s. The Cleveland newspapers, particularly the Cleveland Press, whose editor Louis Seltzer drove the coverage personally, ran the case on the front page for weeks. The headlines were not neutral. Why isn't Sam Sheppard in jail? Ran the press on one famous front page. The coverage shaped public opinion in Cleveland and beyond. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. There had been no intruder. Sam Sheppard had killed his wife himself. The story of the figure was a fabrication. The injuries Sam had sustained were either self-inflicted or exaggerated. The marriage had been troubled. There was a documented affair between Sam and a medical technician at the hospital. The motive was domestic. The killer had been in the house all along. The one person who had been in the house all along. And the elaborate account of an intruder coming up from the lake was the cover. The defense's theory was different. Sam Sheppard had not killed his wife. There had been an intruder in the house. The intruder had come up from the lake side of the property, had attacked Marilyn in the bedroom, had been confronted by Sam, had attacked Sam twice, once in the bedroom, once on the beach, and had escaped down the lake shore. The injuries Sam had sustained were real. The marriage had been imperfect but not violent. The affair existed but did not constitute a motive sufficient for what had happened in the bedroom. In December of 1954, after a trial that the Supreme Court would later describe as a carnival atmosphere, Sam Sheppard was convicted of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. He served 10 years. During those 10 years, his case became the subject of one of the most significant appellate efforts in American legal history. His new attorney was a young Boston lawyer named F. Lee Bailey. Bailey took the case to the federal courts on the grounds that the pretrial publicity in Cleveland had made a fair trial impossible. The argument made its way to the United States Supreme Court. In 1966, the Supreme Court ruled in Sheppard v. Maxwell that Sam Sheppard had been denied his right to a fair trial. The court's decision, written by Justice Tom Clark, became one of the foundational rulings of American law on the relationship between pretrial publicity and the constitutional right to due process. The conviction was vacated. Sam Sheppard was retried in 1966. He was acquitted. He came home. He tried to rebuild a life. He returned briefly to medicine, lost the right to practice, took up professional wrestling for a time, drank, remarried, and died in 1970 at the age of 46. He had spent 10 years in prison, 4 years free, and had not, in the time he had remaining, been able to assemble the life he had wanted from the wreckage of 1954. His son Chip, the 7-year-old who had been asleep in the next room, grew up. He spent decades of his adult life trying to clear his father's name. In 2000, he filed a civil suit against the state of Ohio, seeking a formal declaration that his father had been wrongfully imprisoned, a determination that would have required the court to find that Sam Sheppard had been actually innocent, not merely acquitted at retrial. The civil jury ruled against him. What had happened in the intervening years was the introduction of DNA evidence into the case. A forensic scientist named Dr. Mohammed Tahir, who had worked extensively on cold case DNA, conducted analyses on samples preserved from the original crime scene. The results in Tahir's analysis identified DNA in the bedroom that did not belong to Sam Sheppard, did not belong to Marilyn, and did not belong to Chip. The DNA in Tahir's analysis was consistent with a man named Richard Eberling. Richard Eberling was a window washer who had worked at the Sheppard home in the period before the killing. He had a documented history of crimes against women. He had, in the years following his work at the Sheppard home, been convicted in the killing of an elderly woman in another Ohio jurisdiction. He had died in prison in 1998. The DNA finding, in the analysis presented by the Sheppard family, identified him as the figure who had been in the bedroom. The state of Ohio's analysis of the same evidence reached a different conclusion. The state's experts disputed the chain of custody on some of the samples. They disputed the interpretation of the DNA results. They argued that the results were not sufficient to establish Eberling as the killer. The civil jury in 2000 sided with the state. That is where the case sits, 70 years later. A conviction, a Supreme Court decision, an acquittal, a civil verdict against the family. DNA evidence that points in one direction in one analysis and in another. A husband who served 10 years and died young. A son who spent his life arguing for his father's innocence. A window washer who died in prison without ever being charged. And no person ever held responsible, in a way that everyone agrees on, for what happened in the upstairs bedroom on the morning of July 4, 1954. The Sheppard family home is no longer there. It was sold in the years after the killing. It changed hands several times. In 1993, it was demolished. Where the house stood is now an empty lot. The lake is still there. The bluff is still there. The narrow beach where Sam Sheppard said he had pursued the figure and been struck for the second time is still there. The water still comes in against the shore in the same slow way it came in against the shore on the morning of July 4, 1954. What came from the lake that night, or did not, what went back across it, or did not, is the part of the case that has never been resolved. The bedroom faced the water. The bluff was accessible. The lake was open. Whether anyone came up from the lake side of the property in the early hours of July 4, 1954, and whether anyone went back across the water afterward, is the question the case has never been able to answer. What is certain is the bedroom. What is certain is the woman in it. And what is certain is that whatever happened in that room on that morning came from somewhere, and 70 years later, the only thing the documented record can say with confidence is the direction in which the bedroom was facing. It was facing the lake. 2 homes, 2 people taken from inside them. 2 husbands who said they heard nothing, or almost nothing, until it was already over. There is one more case tonight. A different decade, a different state. A child gone from inside a locked house on Christmas night while her family slept on the floor above. The house is locked. It is a large 3-story home at 755 15th Street in Boulder, Colorado. A Tudor-style house in a quiet neighborhood on the west side of the city, a few blocks from Chautauqua Park, with the Flatirons visible above the rooflines to the south. The house has 15 rooms. It has multiple entrances. It has a basement that runs the length of the structure beneath. It is, on the night of December the 25th, 1996, decorated for Christmas. Inside the house, 4 people are asleep. On the 3rd floor, the top floor, are John and Patsy Ramsey. He is 53, a businessman whose technology company has just had its best year. She is 39, a former pageant participant from West Virginia, a Christian, the kind of mother whose holiday card lists are organized in advance. They have been celebrating Christmas all day with their 2 children and with friends. On the 2nd floor are the children. Burke is 9. He is in his own bedroom. Down the hall from him, in her own bedroom, is JonBenét. She is 6. That is the configuration of the Ramsey house on the night of December the 25th, 1996. By the morning of December the 26th, JonBenét will be gone from her bedroom. Her body will be found, hours later, in the basement of the house. And in the 30 years since, no person has ever been charged in connection with what happened between those 2 facts. The day of December the 25th, in the Ramsey household, had been the ordinary Christmas day of a family that loved Christmas. The children had opened their presents in the morning. The family had attended church. Patsy had cooked. Friends had come over for breakfast. In the afternoon, the family had visited the home of close friends, the Whites, for a Christmas dinner. The dinner had run into the evening. The children had played. JonBenét had eaten. She had been tired by the end of the evening, the way 6-year-olds are tired at the end of a long Christmas day. The drive home from the White's house was short. JonBenét fell asleep in the car on the way. When the family arrived back at 755 15th Street, she did not wake. Her father carried her up the stairs to her bedroom on the second floor. He set her down on the bed. She did not stir. Patsy came in afterward and changed her into pajamas. JonBenét did not wake during the change of clothes. That is the last documented contact with JonBenét while she was alive, according to the family's account given to police. The family went to sleep. John and Patsy went up to the third floor. Burke was already in his own room. JonBenét was in hers. The house was settled. The doors were locked. What happens between approximately 10 o'clock on the night of December the 25th, 1996, and approximately 5:50 on the morning of December the 26th, has been the subject of one of the most analyzed criminal investigations in American history. 30 years of it, 2 grand juries, multiple changes of prosecutor, multiple changes of investigative leadership at the Boulder Police Department, civil litigation, a federal DNA analysis, 2 indictments returned by a grand jury that were never signed by the district attorney, books, documentaries, podcasts, a second formal exoneration of immediate family members, and no charges. What is documented from the morning of December the 26th is this. At approximately 5:50 in the morning, Patsy Ramsey walked down the back staircase of the house. On one of the steps of the staircase, she found a handwritten note. The note was 2.5 pages long. The note demanded a ransom of $118,000, a specific number that, in subsequent investigation, would prove to match very closely the amount of a recent work bonus John Ramsey had received. The note was written in pen, in what investigators would describe as a generally consistent hand throughout, on paper from a notepad later determined to be from inside the Ramsey home. Patsy ran upstairs. She woke her husband. She went to JonBenét's bedroom. JonBenét was not in the bedroom. The police were called. Officers from the Boulder Police Department arrived at the house within minutes. By the standards of modern police procedure for a kidnapping case, what happened over the next several hours would later become one of the most studied case studies of crime scene management in American police training. People were allowed in and out of the house. Friends of the family were called and came over to provide support. Officers searched some areas of the house and not others. The basement, in particular, was not searched thoroughly in the initial response. Hours passed. The ransom note had instructed that a phone call would come at 10 o'clock. The phone did not ring at 10. It did not ring at 11. It did not ring at noon. In the early afternoon, a detective at the house asked John Ramsey to walk through the parts of the house he had not yet checked, to see if anything was out of place. John Ramsey, accompanied by a family friend, went down to the basement. In a small room at the back of the basement, a room used for storage, with no exterior access, he found his daughter. She was deceased. She had been deceased for some time. The cause of death, the Boulder County Coroner's Office would later establish, was a combination of 2 factors that no one had heard happen, neither of which, in any account from the family or from any investigator, made the kind of sound that should have carried through the house to where Burke was sleeping on the second floor, or up to where the parents were sleeping on the third. The details of how she died are not the part of this case that the sleep audience needs from this narration. They are documented. They are available in the public record for anyone who wants to read them. What matters for the thread of tonight's episode is the architecture of the house and the people in it. The house was locked. The doors were intact. The windows were intact, with one exception. A window in the basement that had been broken months earlier and that John Ramsey, by his own account, had broken himself when he had locked himself out of the house. Whether the broken basement window was a possible point of entry has been the subject of decades of investigative dispute. The window was small. The drop into the basement from the window was significant. The basement floor below the window showed no clear sign of an entry. The other family members were upstairs. Burke had been asleep in his bedroom on the second floor, down the hall from his sister. John and Patsy had been asleep on the third floor. The family's account, given to investigators and given consistently across 30 years of subsequent interviews, was that none of them had heard anything during the night. That is the impossibility at the center of the case. A 6-year-old girl had been taken from her bed on the second floor and carried down to a small room in the basement, in a house where her brother was sleeping a hallway away, and her parents were sleeping on the floor above. And none of them, in their accounts, heard her go. The investigation that followed was, by the assessment of nearly every law enforcement professional who later reviewed it, badly compromised in its first hours and never fully recovered. The crime scene was contaminated. Initial interviews were conducted unevenly. Evidence was handled in ways that would, in any modern investigation, be considered serious procedural failures. Suspicion focused, in the early stages, on the parents. The reasons were partly structural. When a child dies in a locked house with only family inside, family is the first place an investigation looks, and partly specific. The ransom note was unusual. The note was very long for a ransom demand. The amount of money requested was strangely precise. The note had been written on paper from inside the house, with a pen from inside the house. The note had been left, not delivered. The family knew the layout of the house. The family had access to the basement. The family was, by the simple geography of where everyone had been, the only people the investigators could place in the house at the time. But the family was also, in 1996 and in the years that followed, never charged. There were 2 grand juries. The first, convened by the Boulder County District Attorney's Office in 1998, returned indictments, but the district attorney at the time, Alex Hunter, declined to sign them. The decision not to sign the indictments was based on his assessment that the evidence available did not meet the standard required to win a conviction. The indictments were sealed. They did not become public until many years later. In the years that followed, advances in DNA testing produced new evidence in the case. Trace DNA was recovered from JonBenét's clothing, DNA that did not match any member of the Ramsey family. The DNA was insufficient to identify a specific person, but it was sufficient, in the assessment of the Boulder County District Attorney's Office, to formally exonerate the immediate family. In 2008, District Attorney Mary Lacey issued a public letter to John Ramsey, stating that the family was no longer considered suspects. Other investigators, including some who had worked the case in its early stages, disagreed with the 2008 exoneration. They argued that the trace DNA could have been deposited on the clothing during its manufacture, and did not necessarily place an unknown person at the scene. The disagreement on how to interpret the DNA evidence has continued for the 17 years since. In the years since 2008, the investigation has been formally reopened more than once. The Boulder Police Department transferred jurisdiction of the case to a cold case unit. Genetic genealogy techniques, the same techniques that, in the late 2010s, began producing identifications in decades-old cases across the country, have been applied to the JonBenét DNA. As of the most recent public statements from Boulder authorities, those efforts have not produced an identification. Patsy Ramsey died in 2006 of ovarian cancer, before the formal exoneration. She died with her daughter's case still open. John Ramsey has spent the years since publicly advocating for continued investigation of the case, and for further DNA analysis using technologies that did not exist in 1996. Burke Ramsey, who was 9 years old on the night his sister died, has grown into adulthood under the long shadow of having been in the house. He has, on occasion, given interviews. He has, more often, not. The house at 755 15th Street still stands. It has been sold multiple times since 1996. Subsequent owners have renovated portions of it. The neighborhood is still the same neighborhood. The Flatirons are still visible above the rooflines to the south. The basement room is still there. The second-floor bedroom is still there. The staircase Patsy walked down at 5:50 on the morning of December the 26th is still there. What no one in that house has ever been able to do in 30 years is account for the path between the second floor and the basement. The bedroom, the hallway, the stairs, the lower hallway, the basement door, the basement stairs, the small storage room at the back. Someone carried a 6-year-old that distance, and whoever it was, no one in the house heard her go. 3 houses, 3 rooms, 3 families who have spent the rest of their lives walking past the same doorway and remembering what was on the other side of it. You are here at this hour because the place that is supposed to be safest is also the place that gives the deepest cold when something happens inside it. There will be more nights like this one, and you will not have to come looking for them. For now, let the houses hold what they have held, and let yourself rest.